So I wanted to just, I think it was, I've got a lot that I guess would follow up on what Romina had said before and perhaps explain it to people who may not be so familiar with these terms. So I just finished my PhD as well. I did it at the University of Sheffield. And so my PhD research focused on Indigenous lands and conservation. And so in engaging with kind of Indigenous peoples and their perspectives, and as well as the murder of George Floyd in the US and this whole outcry again around racism, it led me during the PhD process to consider what coloniality and what decoloniality was, or what decolonization was. And so during the course of my PhD, me and 4 other researchers were exploring this. We came mostly from natural science background. So I'm from Singapore. I'm ethnic majority Chinese from Singapore, and I went to the UK to do my PhD, to do my undergrad, master's, and then the PhD. And I was trained in ecology and natural sciences. So many of the terms that actually Romina mentioned were completely unfamiliar to me when I started the PhD, and we were trying to educate ourselves and understand where we were going. And so we came up with a guide after we kind of did some discussions, did a lot of readings. And I'll share the link to the guide later on in the chat, but you can see the URL there. And so we wanted to understand the impacts of kind of the research process on our research itself. And so that comes from a very different point, I guess, because we're not asking about the funding, because we recognize that as PhD researchers, it's difficult. We're not the ones who actually apply for funding, and that actually has a huge influence on how you can structure your research. In my presentation, I don't actually have any references. They're all on the online guide, which so you'll be able to look through them in your own time later on. And yeah, I'm gonna move on to my presentation. So I wanted to actually highlight that our guide was not called decolonizing, but challenging colonial practices, in part because I recognize this is different for different people, but in part, I was quite uncomfortable with using the term decolonizing curriculum or anything else, because I take seriously the term decolonizing as giving back land. And so the framing of the guide itself is very much framed around challenging colonial practices, in which case I thought it was necessary to explain some of the terms, which is similar to what Romina had presented earlier. So here we talk about colonialism as the policy of control over peoples and places. So that's what European colonialism was. And coloniality, in contrast, is a concept of this system of racialized hierarchies, the dominance of Eurocentric knowledge, and where Eurocentric cultural systems are normalized, which makes what we see in today's world order as neocolonialism, some people would say. And as Romina mentioned, coloniality is a concept developed by Latin American thinkers. So why should we challenge coloniality as researchers? Well, we start from the premise that as knowledge producers, we hold power, because we have the power through our PhD research, through the knowledge that we create, to shape discourses, to influence the way society thinks, to then influence government, sometimes if you interact with policy and policymakers. And so we need to exercise that responsibility over the power. And this paradigm is related to how we see and understand the world. As Romina had mentioned, it's kind of our how we see and understand the world, which kind of is how I would explain ontology very briefly, and how we perceive knowledge, or how we understand the nature of knowledge, etc., which is epistemology. And in mainstream science, it's often taught that science is objective and neutral. And as research, what we need to do is to reduce our own biases and to seek truth, that there is one objective truth out there. And this way of thinking is called positivism. But we are all actually embedded in society, and we have different identities, such as our nationality, our ethnicity, caste, religion, gender, sexual orientation, politics, etc. And all of these affect our ontology and epistemology, as well as the access to opportunities and the privileges that we gain. And so This affects who ends up being able to do the research, primarily global North researchers, the questions that people ask, the approach that's being used in the research, the particular methods, the data being collected, the framing of the results, the kind of output that we produce. But I want to emphasize that although each of our identities and positionalities affect the work that we do, I don't, what I'm trying to highlight and challenge here is not the individual, but the overall process and system. And this is because research and it does not just sit on its own, it's embedded within the wider world. And so looking at the history of knowledge production, we found that universities have often created justifications for colonialism, theories that justified theories of racial hierarchies to justify colonialism historically. Researchers also provided tools to enable colonialism through exploration, mapping of resources to be exploited, botanical research into profit-generating cash crops or timber, and even research into malaria or other tropical diseases were made with the purpose of making places more amenable to colonization. So this is a quote here from Sir Ronald Ross, who is a British doctor, who discovered kind of that mosquitoes were transmitting malaria. And again, this is for the sake of colonization at that point. And then more linked to more contemporary times, many historical universities were and are funded by slavery on sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean. And in what's romantically described as the age of exploration, many natural scientists went to colonies to acquire botanical and zoological specimens and cultural artifacts, oftentimes with the help of local and indigenous peoples, but they are then erased from history. And having all that wealth to fund research and expeditions and having all those collections have contributed to the success of these universities, which are often today perceived as top universities. And so although direct colonialism has ended for most of the world, many of the structures and institutions that were created during colonization persist to the present. Universities and research processes continue to be shaped by coloniality and the unequal power relations that have arisen from colonization. So such as global North researchers having more funding, and they're able to direct where, what, and how research can be done. And this can be perceived as neo-colonial extensions of indirect control, especially when the needs and opinions of those living where the research is occurring are not consulted. Yep, so that's what I was saying before. And a lot of times local researchers are recruited just as logistic managers, translators, data collectors. Their expertise as researchers are not acknowledged, and all of this doesn't help build local research capacity. And publishing costs money, especially open access journals now, money which many global and South institutions may not have. And the dominance of English language and research creates additional barriers. And all of these are kind of part of the wider framework of how research is still very colonial. And so I'm kind of keeping this presentation quite short so that we can have time for questions later. But so how can we begin? I think this leads on from what Romina mentioned before, but reflecting on our positionality and how that has affected your research, considering your research philosophy. Why are you doing research? How is your research used? What is it going to be for? And respecting and making space for non-dominant perspectives, the communities that you might be working with, or kind of reading through other literature, being informed of the historical context, cultural practices, and knowledges of the peoples in the places that you work. And I think a lot of times so I come from a conservation ecology background, and historically the discipline has always been much more, say, animal and plant focused, right? You don't necessarily work with the people, but there are always people in the places that you work in, and kind of recognizing that and listening to them is an important part of how we can kind of challenge this coloniality. Developing equitable relationships in all levels. And I think I want to emphasize here that as PhD researchers, there is a power dynamic between us, but PhD researchers and the professors or their supervisors. And that is a tension that needs to be negotiated in case in case you would like to take a different approach to what your supervisor is recommending. But I think just, I just want to recognize that I don't necessarily have a solution, because it depends on the people. But I think this is where institutions can really come in, because if the university institutes some kind of a challenging coloniality framework, then there is at least recourse for PhD researchers to turn to in terms of the university's framework, to say that, look, I want to do this, that's going to be better, but my supervisor is not on board with it. And consider co-designing research questions, making the research useful for them. And I think Romina had mentioned that as well. And acknowledging field assistants, technicians, translators, anybody who's kind of crossed your path as you go about your research, and offering co-authorship in publications where they do contribute substantially. And then just having some more questions to reflect on is, like, what is the history of your discipline, whether it's in physics or computer science or English and literature. There is always a history of the discipline, and how it has taken, who it's shaped by, and what critiques there are to be aware of from other disciplines, such as science and technology studies, or from other non-dominant epistemological perspectives. What are the methodologies, theories, or underlying logics in your research, and whether or not they are structured by imperialism or colonialism, and whether or not your research output is really only useful for the global north. And I think this might be more perhaps prevalent in kind of technological based research. Asking yourself if there are other questions that should be asked, other ways of seeing the problems, other ways of knowing, local knowledges that should be respected, and kind of input from communities who will be impacted by our research. Say thank you to colleagues who had provided feedback on the guide, Andrea and Judith, as well as other people from the center I was based at, for their support in doing this work. I'm going to end here, and thank you very much for listening.
Jocelyne, thank you for a very insightful presentation. It's a very useful guide for PhD researchers on, as you say, challenging colonial practices. I've certainly learned a lot from your talk. Okay, so we're going to move over to the Q&A stream, which is very busy. And apologies in advance if we can't get through all the questions, but we'll do as much as we can. So just scrolling up to where the questions on your talk began. Okay, brilliant. Conrad asks, do you think it's possible to decolonize in English as opposed to using the mother tongues of the communities where we are consciously trying to engage in a decolonial practice?
Thanks for the question. Sorry, was it that we should decolonize English?
No, can you use English as a language? Can you do decolonize in English using the English language as opposed to using the mother tongues, as the speaker says, of the communities where you're trying to engage in that decolonization?
Thanks for the question. It's a good one. I think it really depends on your community. I guess I'm interpreting this to be when you share your research back with the people who you did research with. I think that should definitely be in the language that they are that they are comfortable with, not in English. I guess it's because it's about giving them what is useful to them, and it should be in whatever language that's comfortable to them. Whereas I see English as, in the domain of academia at the moment. So I'm not quite sure if I'm actually answering the question right, but I do see a separation, right? Like, so English would be when you write your articles. If possible, if you're from a Latin American country and you can publish in Spanish, there are so many fantastic journals that are Spanish based, then definitely do that, right? But then, sometimes if it's an indigenous language, you might not have any outputs that you can produce in those language, then I guess it would be in English. Sorry, I'm not quite sure if I answered that question.
No, that's very helpful, thank you. Okay, an anonymous attendee asked if you could reflect more on what you said about co-design and co-production in research and how it can help to address some of the inequalities referenced.
Well, I think it definitely comes from, I think it's more helpful to understand what field you're in, kind of what kind of research you're doing. I think co-production and co-designing happens a lot when you work on, say, development studies where you're going to places and trying to introduce something to them oftentimes. So for example, where I was based in Sheffield before, there were a lot of fellow PhD researchers working on, for example, maybe solar panels. How can you integrate solar panels into a village and so that they can have a green source of energy, so to speak. Co-designing and co-production would involve going to the community beforehand, understanding, do they actually need the solar panels? Is that actually their main barrier that's causing them electricity problems, or is it actually something else? Maybe it's inequality within the community itself that's blocking the access to electricity. And then figuring out, okay, where is the best place to put it? How can you manage it so that it would have the best results for them? Because it sounds very obvious when you say it, but a lot of times research is done the other way around, where somebody writes a whole proposal who's never been there, and then they plonk the intervention straight in there, and then you kind of try and do your research, but then at the end of the day, it just does not achieve the results that you actually want. But it does depend on what field of research you're talking about, I think.
Thank you very much, Jocelyne. Ian asked if you could say more about the role of PhD supervisors and how they can either reinforce existing practices or challenge new ways of thinking. He asked, how can PhD researchers be supported to kind of navigate the dynamics in supervision practices, including, the power dynamics, and bringing their own kind of lived experiences and cultural perspectives to challenge coloniality?
Thank you. That's a fantastic question. I think it really depends. I mean, I'm sorry that my answers are not great because it always depends, but it does depend.
I think that's the most honest kind of answer. And I can tell you're getting great feedback for your answers in the chat. So please do continue answering questions as you are. So
I think it does depend on who your supervisor is, right? Like where they are from, what kind of personality they have, it depends. But I think for PhD researchers, I think it always helps to have a group of people with you. So for me, I had the people that I was developing this guide with, and we could meet and we could talk about the problems and the frustrations that we have, and it helped. So having if you don't have one already in your department or in your university, I think it would be good to start a group to just. You could do a reading group, read through some of the references that Romina, or you can find on our website as well. On the online guide, and reading through them and talking through the issues that you have, you will find that it kind of really helps you have a grasp of your situation. Say in two situations, right? Say if your relationship, say if the PhD supervisor is not so keen on kind of doing things differently and challenging coloniality, then I feel either you could try and do as much as you can in your research without necessarily upsetting the relationship if that's not what you want. So I'm a very non-confrontational person, and the way I wanted to do my research, I would say, is definitely different to the way that my PhD supervisor traditionally does his research. And I tried my best to kind of do what I could do. So in terms of framing the research questions, in terms of framing the results that I had, that was still accurate to the science that I did, but highlighting these tensions in terms of power dynamics, and nuancing the results that I had, which somebody else who wasn't thinking about coloniality might not have done in their research. So it was just about the writing of it. I wasn't trying to negotiate the relationship with my supervisor at all. But if you feel like you could negotiate your relationship with the supervisor and you want to talk to them about it, maybe they seemed open to it, then I think by all means do that. I think that would be great, right? If you want to change things at different levels. And if your supervisor is really encouraging of trying to do things differently, then I guess that's not really a problem. You guys can go on a journey together. I think it'll be really good. I don't know if that helped.
It very much did. Thank you very much. A question from Marina, who asks, in your views, how can academic publishing support decolonization of academic literature? It's a very kind of a big question, but I think, you know, your perspective will be useful because, you know, yes, so go for it.
I think it is definitely a big question. I mean, the academic publishing is a whole ecosystem to itself. I think there are many problems with it, right? There's the issue of predatory publishers where they don't actually support good science and they're just profiteering off people, oftentimes from low-income countries. Okay, so I'm not explaining this really well. So you have predatory publishers who oftentimes would email researchers. They just web scrape and just email people and ask, would you like to publish? And because publications are such an important, they are the main currency of academia, you have to publish. People in less supported institutions, let's say, might not be able to differentiate between a good publisher and a bad predatory publisher. And if they go with the bad publishers, then they're also oftentimes made to pay while not producing good science. And I think that entire system is just terrible. So there is a list, I can't remember what the name of the Beals list or something, of publishers, predatory publishers that one should not go with. And I would, you know, definitely say that do not go there. But in terms of just kind of proper academic publishing, so to speak, I think on the side of the publishers, I mean, I don't know where this is going to land, or publishers might not listen to this, but I think recognizing that the language is not, how do you say, I think this is something that there are publishers already addressing, right? When they send invitations to review out, they say, please try not to focus on the language, the styles of the language, the grammar, but focus on the science. And it's a good reminder to do that, because at the end of the day, we are still in an English dominant world. But there are also, I think there are also changes being made. There are publications I've seen with at least Spanish, Chinese abstracts, Mandarin Chinese abstracts. And I think it would be helpful to, I think I saw someone's comments about translations of articles. And I think that, you know, we have AI tools now, which can be used for good rather than bad. So, you know, be able to translate articles into the language that one prefers. I think that would be helpful. I think another thing actually that isn't really spoken very much is it would be, I think I'm going to leave it as that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, that was very helpful. And I appreciate we're coming to the end of the talk, but I just wanted to note that it has been noted by one of our anonymous attendees several times that while publishers understandably don't consider translations of articles as original or research, equally they don't proactively translate original articles from other languages into English. So there's a gap there.